and welcome to my channel. I'm your host, Nayat, and today we are going to discuss something that if you follow me on the other platforms, you saw me discussing this in a live roughly around a couple of days prior to me filming this. So, here we go. Okay, so for those who have been in the occult community for a while, you know how difficult it is to worship and especially research on this infernal who my other fellow occultists call Moloch. And although the sources vary just a little bit, I think I can shed some enlightening or on who Moloch actually is, not only as a personal occultist that has a relationship with this being, but also as someone who is, well, an historian. I think I can at least shed some light on who he is and how can we better connect to these aspects of Moloch. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the basis of the name that we have right now, just introduced Moloch. Moloch can mean stuff like sacrifice, or if not sacrifice, in the ancient languages of the Canaanites, the Assyrians, and the Phoenicians, Moloch simply meant king, king of something for their language. That's how we know about Moloch, but we also know variations of the name called Molech. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Because the suffix ek, that is found, for example, not only in Moloch's name, but a start, which for certain accounts and texts found back then, is also called Ashtoreth, which then, of course, with the old grimoires and the Ars Goetia, became Astaroth. But in this scenario, it's not necessarily something that just happened in the context of its own language. By that I mean that the suffix ret came from, well, the Hebrews back then, when they were monotheistic and just worshipping what we now know as Yahweh. They used the suffix to describe gods that were, well, not aligned with their values because they were monotheistic. So, in this context, the reth is part of a word which means sin, and the word sin incorporated into these deities, for example, mean Astarte the sinful, because she is not part of the cult of Yahweh, or she's not meant to be worshipped within the context of Yahweh. If we put that into other perspectives, such as Moloch becoming Molech, it means the king of sin. So it's kind of a way of, in the ancient times, of these deities being ridiculed and discriminated by people who don't really follow them or wish to ban or cease with their cult somewhere around the Levant. We can indeed start searching for names that seem similar or sound similar to Moloch. And why are we doing this? Well, because when you are an historian or you study history, you have to specifically pay attention to the language. Because it's languages, for example, like Latin, that unified an area under one language, under one rule. By that meaning that if you want to find a credible source of something, you have to look within the language and the regional context of what you're searching for. In this case, this is not on the times of ancient Rome, which is a bit more difficult, but we can still find some things that will link the name Moloch to Melqart. And who is Melqart? Well, Melqart is many things, and his cult really spread throughout the Mediterranean and even until the Roman Empire times. For you see, the Romans used the name, or they saw Melqart as the Carthaginian Hercules, which is weird. But it's also partially true. For you see, when the Phoenicians spread around the Mediterranean way back in the days, they also brought the culture of their land to other lands and to other people. the Phoenicians, especially the Canaanites, had more um, influence with the lands of Egypt through not only cultural exchanges via tradings, but also conflicts in the area that led to a development of a mingling of cultures between the two regions. But that's like different. The Phoenicians were a little bit more expensive. They always sought out to make different cities where they would trade and create trade routes in order to unify the Mediterranean under their commercial rule. By that I mean that it was common for the Phoenicians to sail away and found and create several cities whose main patron god, or they were attributed to Melqart, because Melqart is their um, main deity. It's the main masculine deity of their pantheon. And you don't even need to look much, because Melqart is the patron god, or was the patron god, of a city in Lebanon that nowadays, and pardon my English, it's not my main language, it's called Tira or Tyre, I believe. I'll put it somewhere in the screen. Okay, and now you're probably wondering, like, okay, Nayad, but what about like the child offerings? How about the Old Testament? How about X, Y, and Z? Well, uh, to put it simply bluntly, it's a mix of the appropriation and the aspects of the figure of Melqart and how they adapted throughout the land and throughout the local cults that were already there established when the Phoenicians arrived, and also a bit of historical rewriting by the Old Testament, because let's not forget that the Old Testament also has very much themes of installing the worship of Yahweh exclusively throughout several regions of like the Middle East. And well, we been knew how this usually goes, but this is where the name Moloch or Molech comes from. It's around the same time. Well, that's because historians believe that the Baal we found in the Bible, is not only than Melqart, simply rewritten to fit, well, a religious narrative of us versus them. And this Melqart is known to the Phoenicians as the god of strength and the god of the fallen heroes, the ones that die and are brought back to life. And because of his strength and his courage and his ability of rebirth, he was very widely worshipped among the Phoenicians. But not only that, and this is even more interesting, is that the Melqart that we know from historical sources was the son of Mot. And we'll get to the name Mot in a second, because this also reveals something interesting. You see, the god Melqart was the protector of the gates of the underworld. This was a task that was assigned to him upon death and rebirth. So, by protecting the gates, he must live in the world of the living, but also the world of the dead. And even more important than that, Mot himself is a bit like Hades. You know how in Greek mythology, and some historians even argue that Hades is both the god and the place? Mot is similar. Mot is both death, or the god of the underworld, and the underworld himself. It is Mot who slays, well, Baal during the cycle of Baal. And it's Anat who rescues Baal from the underworld, because it's more than established then the Phoenician slash Canaanite underworld is an underworld which you, well, cannot escape, because Mot steals and sucks the life out of you. So you could even argue that Mot himself is the gates of hell that get depicted amongst like any Abrahamic religion, being the jaws of a mouth opening, because Mot himself is extremely hungry, because death is always hungry for more, because we all cannot escape death. And that's what makes Mot so terrifying to the Canaanites, to the point where they usually do not worship him, but they would rather worship deities like Melqart or Haran, who is also known as Horus. And in this also very interesting, family dynamic of Melqart being the son of Mot, Melqart is also the twin brother of Haran in this, well, mythology. And on this context of dualities that we find, we also find out that Harun, who eventually was called Haran, is the co-ruler of the underworld. So he rules equally side by side with his twin brother, Melqart. And that makes them like this dual thing that we find ruling over the underworld. And for my people that did the Clipotic tree, isn't that a bit too familiar to what we find, let's say, on the last sphere? Isn't that a bit too familiar? I'm gonna let that sink in just for a little bit. We also have to point out that none of these findings of Melqart, Moloch, Molech, and the suffix thing erase anything we know about him in occultism. And by that I mean that because Moloch became such widespread thing among several cultures due to the Phoenicians, it's quite possible that he is all this. That his whole entire purpose is that he is all this. Because, like many infernals, he tends to assimilate things that are attributed to him. But isn't it still funny that Talmiel could be essentially Mot, just disguised as something else? That would be very interesting. But besides what we know about Melqart, there's also an Ammonite god called Milcom. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know much about him yet because it's another completely different religion. But as far as, well, my UPG lets me to believe, which is zero authority, but this is all just a little funny little debate that I felt like recording. It is very much a wide possibility that the Moloch that you found in several occult texts and how so many occultists speak about Moloch, there's a very likely scenario that Moloch is Melqart, and many of the things we know about him today, either in occult circles or through Bible study, are assimilations and distortions of what we know from the Canaanite religion, and that's the point that I was trying to make. But I'm gonna be honest, this is my first ever video that I ever recorded, ever. So if you like it, drop a like. If you feel like you have something to add up to the conversation, you can comment it down below. And if you like to hear me yapping, there's a little subscribe button you could do. But, well, if we never see each other again, that's fine too. I'll see you around. Once again, I'm your host, Nayad, and take it easy.